wanted to say that this session is recorded and hosted under the IGF Code of Conduct and the UN Rules and Regulation. So welcome you all to the DNS Abuse in the Age of COVID-19, IGF pre-event session number 47. The moderator can now take over.
Thank you very much over there at the IGF. Good morning, evening, afternoon, whatever time of the day it is, wherever you are. My name is John Crane. I am the Chief Security, Stability and Resilience Officer at the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers. Today, we're going to run you through a panel where we're going to discuss what happened during the early days of COVID-19 and a little bit about what is happening still today. We're going to have 4 sessions with 4 individual speakers. And we're going to do them, I believe, in this order. Elena Plexida will start us off talking about the DNS. She's the Vice President of Government and IGO Engagement at ICANN. She will be followed by Adiel Aplogan, who is the Vice President of Technical Engagement at ICANN. We'll then be taken into a discussion of some of the projects at ICANN by Dr. Samana Tajal Zadehub. And then finally, we will have Mark Rogers, who's the Vice President of Cybersecurity at an organization called Okta, who many of you may know if you do online signing into systems. With that, welcome everybody, and I would like to hand over to Elena.
Thank you, John. I hope you can all hear me. So let's start with the DNS, the domain name system. So what is the domain name system? To reach another person on the internet or to access a website, you have to type an address into a computer. Those addresses are the main way computers that make up the internet find one another. The addresses that computers understand are a series of numbers, so the so-called IP addresses. However, this long series of numbers can be difficult for the human mind to remember. For instance, there is no way I can remember a long number such as, and I'm reading it from inside, 192.0.7.10. This is the ICANN's website IP address. Therefore, the domain name system is there to use letters instead of numbers to form a name that is easier to remember. And it links a precise name with a precise series of numbers. For example, to reach the ICANN website that I mentioned earlier, you navigate to www.icann.org instead of navigating to 192.0.7.10. That's the DNS. It is a system designed to make the internet accessible to us human beings. It is a fundamental internet technology, and its effective operation is crucial for every internet user in the world. Every email you send uses the DNS. The right-hand side of the in an email address uses the DNS to resolve. Every time you visit a website on a web browser, it uses the DNS. Next slide, please, John. Internet users generally aren't even aware that they need, let alone that they use the DNS. Internet users do not realize they use it over 100 times each day. In turn, as users, the users expect it will always just work. That is, in fact, the biggest challenge we face, ensuring the stability of the DNS so it always just works for internet users. Next slide, please. So same way users just expect the DNS will just work, they also expect it will just work properly. What is the difference, though, between a DNS that works and works properly and securely versus a DNS that is insecure? When the DNS is secure, internet users can navigate to the correct sites. Our emails are delivered properly to the intended recipient. Apps, applications can be trusted to do what they are expected to do. Whereas when the DNS is insecure, navigation unexpectedly takes us to the wrong site. Our computing devices become infected with malware. Our identities or our money even are stolen from us. All these are serious issues that relate to the security of users online. So they're very important. Allow me to hand over now to Adiel, who will introduce you to DNS abuse, which is what can make the DNS insecure. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Samane, for that wonderful introduction to what the DNS is. I will quickly take you through why it's important to understand how that system that we all rely on to use the internet can be abused. As you have heard from Samane, everything we do as user on the internet will first use the DNS to match name that we usually use to IP addresses. That alone attract bad actors because they know that everyone uses this system. So by abusing it, they can have access to information. They can use it to target vulnerable user. They can also use it to organize attack against individual or organization because almost all traffic, all access to information online use the DNS. So it's important to understand that because it will help also in local policy definition. Next slide, please. So how is this abused? When you touch on the DNS or you disrupt the way the DNS work, you can disrupt a whole section of the economy. You can disrupt how online transaction operates. You can disrupt government services, all kind. You can disrupt social network. You can disrupt medical services as well. So it's critical, I will say, to keep that service safe and protect. Bad actor, knowing that, will use different way, different technique and trick to have access to insert themselves in between the DNS service. Few vectors that they use, they can maliciously register a domain name by trying to trick user to use a domain name that looks like a genuine domain name by changing one character or using what we call international character in the domain name. They can also hijack the whole process the DNS used to resolve IP address. That means they will put themselves in the middle and request to match a name to an IP addresses goes to the wrong place and give back the wrong responses. So instead of going to where you want to go genuinely, you go to a bad actor servers and you receive, of course, the wrong information. Cache poisoning is another way of disrupting the service by injecting wrong answer into what the component of the DNS that we call the cache, which stores some information for being reused later. They can also hijack the registration process itself. That means when people register a domain name or have to register a domain name, they use certain services provided by a registrar or domain name reseller. And that process can also be hijacked using wrong information to either steal personal information or also register domain name that can impersonate service online. One very vicious attack or use of the DNS by bad actor is to corrupt the DNS data on your device. That means on each device, there is a definition of, if you want to access something online, this is the DNS you use. This is your first step to resolve the name that you want to access. So imagine that that first step is manual with, and instead of using the DNS where you have to get the information, you are redirected to another DNS where you are served either a malware, you are served a wrong answer, or a virus. And that is hard to identify, because it can touch everyone devices. It can also target your home gateway. That means we all use router or gateway in our house to connect to the internet, and this specific misuse of the DNS can happen at that level, where your gateway is corrupted and it giving you the wrong DNS address, or serving you completely a malware. And it's hard to detect, because there is no single place to have control over everyone's devices and check the responses, the DNS responses that each of them is having. So unless it is detected and each ISP and each service provider starts providing information to the user to check this, it's an attack that is very vicious and hard to detect. Next slide, please. So, because we are usually agnostic of the DNS, because we type, information on our devices, name on our devices, and we get the service we want. We go to the website we want. We usually are unaware that something is happening at the background. There is a process at the background that allows us to have access to the information. So that makes us naturally vulnerable to this system, the fact that it is something completely transparent to us. And for ICANN, it's important that we continue to raise awareness of the importance of the DNS here, and specifically to allow DNS operators to have the appropriate incentive and knowledge to protect the DNS, to run a DNS infrastructure that is secure and resilient, so that user can really trust the service that they are consuming online. And to do that, not only ICANN has the mission to coordinate the allocation and assignment of those name and number, but we also monitor trend and abuse online, what is happening, so that to inform our community and the community in general on what to do, how to mitigate some risks that we are seeing coming, and more generally to work with us to maintain a secure and resilient DNS infrastructure. And next slide, please. So, given the situation we have been over the past few months, ICANN have used its research arm, the Security and Stability and Resiliency team, specifically to kind of assess the situation, to kind of see, with this very specific situation and particular pandemic situation we are going through, is there something that we see from those bad actors exploiting the situation to either further abuse the DNS registration system itself, or even they abuse the infrastructure, because that will help us as well in the situation to inform the community, to inform actors on what to do. So the next presentation by our colleague Samane Tajaliza Delcourt will take us through some of those initiatives that ICANN has launched at the beginning of the pandemic to monitor, to measure this bad behavior using the DNS and share them. So I will pass the floor back to Samani to take us to that ICANN observation during that period. Thank you.
Thank you, Adiel. This is Samane from the ICANN SSR group. Today I will be talking on behalf of the work that our group has been doing at the COVID time. So as my other colleagues have already explained, in the cybersecurity landscape, when big events happen, they normally associate with a rise in domain name registrations, and COVID was also not an exception. There was a window of opportunity for mistakes being made by the weakest link, which is normally human errors. So it was expected that the opportunity will be used also for cyber attacks. Next. This is the view as it's reported by the Domain Tools, which is an industry player which does work on domain registrations mainly. So as you can see, the trend shows from January to May of this year, and in March, half March, there is a rise between the domains that they scored with their methodology as high risk. We at next slide, please. We at ICANN also developed our own identification approach. We started with a series of pandemic-related keywords, a smaller set, and we adapted several different methods to basically boost our baseline set that we had. For this, we used a series of zone files that ICANN has access to, and very few ccTLD zone files that we could get access to. Next slide, please. What we have seen from January to June was similar in the domain that we have identified, was kind of a similar trend with a peak between mid and late March up until to April. Next slide, please. What we have also seen was more concentration of registered domains on certain keywords. As you can see on the pie chart, for instance, the keywords COVID or mask or corona were the words that were mostly used in these maliciously registered domain names. We've also seen different categories of keywords. For instance, disease names like COVID, nCoV, SARS, but also countermeasures such as mask, lockdown, quarantine, and some collateral which were like Zoom, WebEx, etc. We've also seen words in different non-English languages. The reason why our numbers with non-English terms were not much higher was because we did not have access to that many ccTLDs, which would expect more language diversity. Next slide. This initial set was the data that we could collect and not intelligence that we could be sure that that it does not contain false positive. To further make the data as an intelligence, we did several more checks to provide evidence on this. Next slide. We checked API through API calls. We checked several external sources that collect evidence on maliciously registered or compromised domains. One of the sources that we used is called VirusTotal. Some of you may already be familiar with it. They report on infected domains as well as URLs, as well as the time that they have been seen and the source that it's reported from. Next slide, please. Another resource that we've used was the Alien Vault OTX API. Here, there are several reports. What we have used in this report was the vetted list that could provide further evidence on whether or not a domain that we have marked it as malicious is actually seen by other sources as well. Next slide, please. Finally, we used Fish Tank and we used the reports that were of high confidence. Fish Tank reports a confidence level, as you can see in the slide. It also reports a timestamp. So that's also another good source that we could verify whether the reports we've seen are actually used in any attacks. Next. As well as Google Safe Browsing, one last source that we have used to check our reports. These were just examples of the methods we adapted to verify whether or not we can translate the data we see into verifiable evidence. What we did with the data that we have collected and verified was to share it with registries and registrars. Next slide, please. This is a summary of what is collected in this project called DNS Sticker. From January to September, we've collected around basically detected around 235,000 pandemic-related domains, which were only concentrated on phishing and malware distributions. Next slide, please. What we did in summary was basically to take zone files, domain names that are newly appeared in the zone files as an input, search for a set of keywords that I've already talked to you about. If we didn't see the keyword, we stopped the search. If the keyword was found, then we verified our tags with lookups in the third-party intelligence sources, such as the APIs and lists that I talked about, VirusTotal, etc. If the evidence was sufficient, then we gathered additional DNS information, such as the geolocation, the IP address, and other evidence that we needed to be able to basically figure out who to report to. If we managed to gather that intelligence and sufficient information, then we sent a report to the registry or registrar associated with the domain. And otherwise, we stopped the search. Next, please. What was interesting was that roughly an order of magnitude was lost at each stage or gate of this flowchart that I just showed. We started with thousands of registrations per day. We found reports on hundreds of them, and sufficient evidence was only on tens per day. Next. In conclusion, definitely, as others also reported, we found evidence on abuse, COVID-related abuse that was going on there at the time, but we did not find sufficient evidence nearly close to the levels that were that some figures suggested out there on internet. That was about my presentation. Now I would like to hand in to Mark Jacobs to tell us about the CTI Leaks view on how they observed DNS abuse at COVID-19 age.
Hi, my name is Mark Rogers. I'm the VP of Cybersecurity at Okta. I'm also a white hat hacker. Have been the head of security at DEF CON for a number of years. And so when the pandemic broke, we in the community looked to see what we could do. Next slide. One of the first things that was very clear to us is there was going to be an uptick in terms of the issues that you see during the pandemic. Bad guys always exploit major events, and global events are like honey to flies. It's a really easy opportunity because they know that they can register DNS names that will be very effective lures and that will draw people in and allow them to deploy secondary tactics like malware, like phishing, even just simple scams to try and get you to donate money. So we know there was going to be a problem. On top of that, we saw a record number of vulnerabilities being disclosed this year. In fact, just by September this year, more than 25,000 CVEs, vulnerabilities, were reported to the National Vulnerability Register, which blows previous records into pieces. We also realized that many companies were completely caught on the hop. They either didn't have pandemic plans or they didn't have preparations for isolated working, and that left them incredibly vulnerable. Next slide. So we decided to create the CTI League. The idea behind the CTI League was it's a open source, free community where anyone could join in who had the right skills to do something. We specifically focused on the medical sector as we saw that as being not just one of the more vulnerable sectors during the pandemic, but also a critical sector during the pandemic. The last thing we wanted to see was hospitals being taken offline on a regular basis when people needed the hospitals to stay alive. And so we focused on it. It was a hard challenge because many hospitals don't have very strong security. Given a choice between spending money on drugs or doctors or cybersecurity, most hospitals spend their money on drugs and doctors. And also, just looking at the US alone, more than 70% of medical facilities in the US are actually tiny facilities that don't have any dedicated security resources at all. So that's a challenge. And when you consider that many of the large institutions have a challenge in keeping up to date, how on earth are the small institutions going to be able to keep up? Next slide. So the CTI League is a cross-industry volunteer organization that spans more than 80 countries now and around 22 different time zones. In terms of demographics, it's roughly 10% from government and law enforcement, 6% from national certs, 7% directly from the medical sector, and 77% the information security community. And that's people from every security company you can think of, non-security companies, anyone with a security background who can contribute, came forward and joined. We're roughly 1,500 members now and are all working together to the common cause of how can we tackle this issue. And in the next slides, I'd like to think you're going to see that actually we were quite successful and that there is a template here that can potentially be followed for future problems. Next slide. Looking at the attacks that we see within the league, we realized that actually it's not easy to attribute where they're coming from. Roughly 51% of the attacks that we were tracking are coming from North America and Europe. And that doesn't mean that it's North America and Europe that's doing the attacks. What we discovered is that the bad guys are setting up infrastructure in advance in these countries and leveraging that infrastructure to get close to their targets. And by doing that, it confuses the picture. And so origination doesn't equal attribution. But what it does mean is that attacks against healthcare are a global problem, and you need a global team that focuses on all countries in the world to support them during events like this. Next slide. Some of the organizations we collaborate with include major law enforcement and health bodies. That collaboration has been key to the success of the league. It's through collaboration, breaking down the silos that normally stop the security community from working across borders or across industry groups, that slows things down. The bad guys during these events come together and work together. Why can't we? And the CTI League has demonstrated that it is possible to do that. The collaboration with these organizations has been phenomenal. We've had amazing help from groups all over the world, from countries that we would never normally deal with. And that help has enabled us to be far more effective than we ever could have been in any of our individual roles. Next slide. Unsurprisingly, much of what we're finding that's being exploited is old. When you look at things like infrastructure vulnerabilities, they're things that were patched months or even years ago, but they're not being completely addressed. All of the research that we do is non-invasive. So, for example, we don't go and do penetration tests against hospitals. We would never want to do something like that during a pandemic. This is done using tools like Shodan, for example, where we're able to search the internet looking for listening systems that are vulnerable. And this is an example of the kind of stuff that we are finding within just 1 week. Next slide. But we're also seeing new stuff come out that we really shouldn't be seeing. We need to learn from our past mistakes. 2020 has seen some of the simplest critical exploits released since 1990. A good example would be the Citrix and F5 vulnerabilities. The directory transversal methodology, which is basically just being able to know the right path name to put into something or exploring a path name, literally brought down organizations and is continuing to bring down organizations. It is something that should have been found within any robust SDLC process. So we as an industry, security, technology, need to think, why are these vulnerabilities that we knew about for decades still coming back to haunt us? Even worse, many of the initial assessments of these vulnerabilities were inaccurate. They either provided poor assessments of the impact. For example, the F5 critical did not indicate that you could completely take over the appliances if the bad guy attacked it in the right way. This inaccurate assessment means that organizations trying to prioritize patching or trying to prepare for the issues are unable to do so. And that is a terrible situation to find yourself in when you're facing such a vulnerability of issues. And on top of that, as I've said before, organizations large and small are failing to keep up with the volume of patches. And after this pandemic, there needs to be a hard conversation about how we can help these organizations provide patches. If medical facilities within the United States are unable to keep up with the volume of patches, what hope do medical facilities on the African continent have in keeping up with the same kinds of patching issues? This is a global problem that we need to think about and come up with global solutions. Next slide. So what are the bad guys doing? Well, the reality is there is a broad spectrum of threats with a really broad spectrum of goals. We're seeing attacks that go against individual employees, things along the lines of phishing emails. We're seeing attackers targeting internal tools. I'll come back to that one in a minute. We're seeing attackers go after partners because they realize that now you have partner organizations, for example, a parking organization that's responsible for infrastructure inside a large, normally secure organization, that they can go after because the employees are all isolated and vulnerable. And by exploiting that chain of trust, they can work their way through. And we're also seeing attacks against infrastructure. Vulnerable infrastructure is being scanned constantly. And the attackers who are getting in are using old exploits to do this. Many of the recent ransomware attacks that you're reading about in the press are leveraging old vulnerabilities to get their foothold in order to deliver sophisticated malware packages or ransomware packages. We're seeing the data that gets stolen either sold on the dark web, we're seeing accounts being sold on the dark web, and we're even seeing access to companies that have been compromised being sold. There are thriving economies around things like business email compromise that have all grown around this. Next slide. The simplest attacks are the ones that are proving the most effective. So simply registering a convincing looking DNS entry is an incredibly effective attack vector. People look at it and think, who's going to fall for that? But the reality is, when you combine all of the issues that are going on right now, the isolation, the fact that attackers can reach out and directly connect to people, and the sophistication with which they're executing these things, it equals a disaster. In a typical, pre-COVID phishing campaign, you would see a badly spelled email landing in somebody's email box that doesn't necessarily convince anybody. What we're seeing now is that the attackers are using open source intelligence techniques to find out more about their targets, to learn the lingo that they use, to learn the names of the tools they use, to find DNS that they commonly use so they can use similar naming schemes, and to duplicate things like internal tools so they look convincing before they make a phone call to the target, leave a message and say, I'm your IT department, you need to click on this page, on this link in order to do this. And people are falling for it. The highly publicized Twitter attack fell to exactly this kind of attack. So if companies like Twitter are falling to this, what hope do smaller companies have? And yet this is probably one of the most simple attacks in the attack ecosystem. Next slide. 2020 will see people being the primary targets. That's my belief, and I think the effects that we're seeing in the press will continue this. They're either being targeted so they can steal information, or they're being targeted so they can become vectors to deliver payloads into organizations. Somehow we need to rethink how we assess risk. In the old pre-pandemic world, assessing whether or not your data was at risk or your organization was at risk was a case of getting somebody to look at your organization to do a penetration test. But in today's world, the security of your sensitive data and whether or not you fall afoul of regulations like GDPR may be entirely dependent on how secure the wireless access point in your employees' houses, and whether or not someone has poisoned the DNS that's inside that router so that anything they do is going through a man-in-the-middle attack scenario. We need to think about how we can better protect our people. Next slide. Just as a kind of a final example on how effective that we can be when we work together, this is just 1 month's worth of work done within the CTI League. These are malicious domains. As previously discussed, there's been an incredible explosion in terms of bad domains. These are the ones that were clearly identified as being malicious, that were tracked into campaigns or which were extracted from malware by dissecting them. And these are the ones that we were able to take down by working with law enforcement, by working with domain registrars, and by working with other security companies. By collaborating, we're able to make a significant dent in what the bad guys are doing. And while it's an ongoing battle, if we keep this kind of model of working together and uniting against these threats and actively taking them down, not only do we cost the bad guys money, but we disrupt all their operations. Next slide. So, one of my final thoughts, we must not let silos remain a major challenge. We are stronger together. We should use open source intelligence against yourself and your organization. Know what's out there. Look at LinkedIn. Look at all the other online data sources and see what's being leaked. Check your DNS. How much DNS is visible externally, and what does that tell someone about your organization? And finally, somehow, we need to prioritize patching. 2020 has been a challenge, but we actually do have the tools to make a difference. We just need to use them together. We need to collaborate. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that, Mark. As you know, we participate in the CTI League and quite a few other such subgroups. There's more than one out there, right? There's a few of them. We're going to take questions from the audience. Please use the Q&A pod if you want to put them in there. I see there's some in there already, but I'm going to take the liberty of asking one myself of Mark while I've got him here. You've been doing this for a long time. You know, you've probably at least as old as I am. What do you think, from the DNS perspective and the DNS industry's perspective, are the lessons that can be learned from the CTI League and also the kind of modus operandi that we're seeing the bad guys use during these times?
So if you consider that some of the most devastating and effective attacks are the simplest ones, the root of all of those attacks is DNS. You know, with the phishing campaign that I mentioned that took down Twitter, there were malicious domains being registered on a regular basis by the bad guys. Tracking what's going on in terms of DNS is key to this, because not only is it a pre-indicator to some of the bad things that are going on, but it is the very foundation on which the bad guys are building their stuff. And if we are able to make this more secure, to build greater trust within DNS, and to stop the exploitation of DNS, I think we will see a lot of bad guy campaigns come tumbling down like a house of cards.
Okay, thank you for that. Luna, would you like to read out the questions in the Q&A, or would you like me to do it?
No, I'm happy to do it. So the first question is from Jonathan Zuck. One of the points of contention when analyzing the quantity of DNS abuse seems to be timing. The speed with which a domain can switch between being hot to being parked makes taking a snapshot of abuse registrations problematic. How can we better account for the challenge that an attack is nearly always over by the time it's reported?
Okay, well, I think there's a couple of people here that could probably answer that. I'm going to give Samina the first shot at it, as she's doing a lot in the measurement of these issues. Go ahead, Samina.
Thank you, John. From my point of view, that's very true, and that highlights the critical role that the registrar can play. So that if the domains or high-risk domains could be detected at the time of registration or briefly after, and the registrars could do further investigations of whether or not that is going to be a malicious domain, or with use of predictive work that would already cut a lot from the time that is used by the industry to report the domain. So basically to cut the link that we are waiting for reports to come in, whereas to do the work, the pre-work ourselves.
And we know that there are people in the industry doing predictive analysis, etc. And sticking with Samina, is that particularly complex or particularly expensive to do? I'm not somebody with a doctorate in this area, so if you could speak to that.
Indeed, there are several registry and registered or already in the industry that are adopting these methods. It is resourceful in terms of computation if one wants to have accurate predictions. That's one difficulty about it. The other is that you need to feed constant ground truth, which is a list of domains that you're sure, 100% sure they were maliciously registered. Registrars mostly could have access to those lists, but for researchers, outsiders, it's harder to have access because with blacklists, it's harder to verify if a domain is 100% abused or not.
Okay, and Mark, obviously in the league, speed of takedown is kind of everything, right? Because the longer it's up, the longer people are victimized. So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so it's speed and accuracy. And I'm going to play the devil's advocate a little bit. I think that we need to get better at doing this because some of the traditional methods that we're using have evolved over decades of use with DNS. And while there is some promising stuff that's coming out, I think we need to come up with ways that track the behavior of domains much more efficiently and in a much more scalable way. Because not only are we seeing domains that pop up and disappear quite regularly, like the phishing campaigns, these domains were being registered and parked for a while, pop up, do stuff, then disappear. But we're also seeing legitimate domains being hijacked. Several high-profile phishing cases that we investigated involved absolutely honest, legitimate sites being hijacked and leveraged for this, because they know that if they take a site that has a good Alexa ranking, it's got trust attached to it, and they can exploit that. And somehow we're going to have to come up with a way to track this, not just so that we can record the footprints in sand for investigation later, but also, like, I'd like one day to get ahead of the bad guys instead of constantly following behind them.
Wouldn't that be nice? Luna, would you like to read another question, please?
Yes. The next one is from Wim de Gazelle. Are the attacks and threats mentioned in the CTI slides all DNS related or a mix of different types of threats and attacks?
The attacks.
Yeah, go ahead, Mark.
So the attacks on that slide are malicious domains. And so they're a mixture of phishing domains that were literally extracted out of phishing emails that we ingested, or C2 domains and other malicious assets extracted from reverse engineering exploits or malware. So it's kind of a mixture, but I would say the majority of them are phishing domains that were ingested into the platform.
Interesting. Luna, another question, unless anybody else wants to speak to that. It really was about CTI, so.
Okay, the next one is from Nadir Al-Araj. Would bad guys using AI to do their work, particularly when you've said that bad guys using smart algorithms?
I'm going to hand this one to Mark again. Are the bad guys using AI? Do we know?
So I don't see bad guys using a lot of AI in terms of the DNS space. They are certainly leveraging AI in other areas. For example, if you look at information manipulation, if you look at image manipulation, deepfakes, etc., AI plays a significant role in that. The days of intelligent threats moving around the internet, I don't think are quite here yet, but I do believe that that's coming. On the flip side, I know of several significant security companies that are leveraging AI heavily to look at user behavior, application behavior, and other things. So I think it's a war that's being fought on both sides.
Yeah, it's always fascinating to see how the bad guys progress as we see them evolving and using new technology. So I think we should expect them to use everything that is at hand for them. Luna, would you like to read
Yep.
one more?
From Judith Hellstream, where will we find a copy of these slides?
We are going to find a way to either put them on the IGF or to push them to all the participants. We're actually working with them at this moment. And I believe there are a couple of questions in the chat. Could those people, if they wanted to answer them, please put it into the Q&A. But Adiel, sort of, are there other things that you think we as an industry and or ICANN as an organization can do to help in this area, either, you know, not necessarily even in a technical sense, but also in maybe outreach and education?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, John. And sure, I mean, if we listen to what just Mark just explained, I think outreach is key. And more we get people to understand the risk that comes with running, you know, specifically the DNS in the case of ICANN, and getting more people to be careful and also implement best practices will help. From ICANN perspective, of course, we will do research, we will find out what the trends are, we will look at where things are going. But at the end of the day, is how we make those information available to users and prepare them and helping them, pointing them to where the information is to prepare them, which is key. And ICANN is putting a lot of effort in this area, has been doing that and increasing that lately through capacity building, through promotion of some of the research work that we are doing, and a few other initiatives that are being led. I think also the challenge for us from the technical community as well is how we take the message beyond the usual people in our circle, usual circle, and get the message out to other people. Mark talked about the medical sector, for instance. I mean, people who are in charge of security in those areas or around the DNS in those areas barely come to where we meet and where we talk about these things. So we have also to be innovative in the way we make sure that these messages and the criticality of the DNS specifically reach those people who we don't talk to.
And we also know, Samina, that there are also efforts within industry. We've seen a couple of programs from both registries and registrars to try and help tackle abuse. And I know we've been having discussions with them around other measurements. Could you maybe talk a little bit about what other things we might be able to measure that might help us get a better insight into what's happening?
Yes, there are, from my point of view, there are a couple of things that could be measured. And I've also seen a question about this related to this in the chat, that there are things that can be measured from outsiders' point of view, which might not necessarily, for instance, like abuse concentrations or the time that it takes for a domain to be taken down, or let's say abuse persistence. If it is measured from what we can see from blacklists or block lists, we might not achieve 100% accuracy, but as researchers or people that are only viewing what is reported, but we could try to develop basically what we would give the community would be methods with which data can be measured. Now the input would be more accurate if it is what is called ground truth, or a data that is 100% accurate, which industry players might have better access to, but it doesn't necessarily mean that what is measured by anybody that outside of registries or registrars, it doesn't indicate anything, or it's not worth it. Apart from the time, that is one very good indicator of how players are dealing with mitigation strategies rather than concentration. We could also measure other factors that can play a role. For instance, how registry or registrar properties, such as the security measures that they are offering, or the infrastructure that they have for domain management, or the prices, domain prices that might affect peaks and downs in malicious registrations or domains that are being hijacked. These are just examples from the back of my mind that researchers and industry players could pick up and do work on. And obviously, we as ICANN are also doing work in these areas with the help of registry and registrars, with discussions with them and receiving input from the measures they take and their practices, etc.
Okay, interesting. So this is a area that this session, it was focused very much on parliamentarians, and I wonder how much of this is like almost science fiction to them. So I would, if you are a parliamentarian or in governance and looking to learn more about this, I would recommend that you reach out to ICANN. You can reach out to Eleanor if you're in the European region, or in the end, you can always reach out to myself or anybody on this panel from the staff, and we'll happily help you. So, Mark, in the world of the CTI League and collaboration, what next? How do we keep that going? How do we move that forward?
That's the $1 million question for us, because we're aware that we've been blessed by, the sword of Damocles, which has meant that many people have been concerned by what's going on and have been stuck at home. But what happens when this all breaks down? We're hoping to build structures and encourage collaboration to make it going. But what would help from policymakers and parliamentarians is recognition that the private sector, when pulled together, can actually perform some really good work and help. The trick is creating the right structures, and I think there's going to be a lot of lessons learned coming out of the CTI League, which will be made available to any policymakers who are interested. And as you mentioned before, there are other organizations like the CTI League that sprung up that worked on this, some creating medical equipment and some also working in the cyberspace as well. And I think the lessons that come from this are ones that we need to learn. We have to scale up in what we're doing. We can no longer operate by just triaging problems within specific countries or specific regions. We need to think globally, and we need to be able to act globally. And that only works through collaboration, and collaboration on a national scale is very difficult, but collaboration on a private sector scale is very feasible. And I think the CTI League has proven that it can be done.
Yeah, it was certainly an interesting solution to a problem that needed fixing at the beginning of the COVID. And of course, COVID continues. So the CTI League and the other groups are still active. For people in the industry, I know there was a lot of DNS industry folks involved in the various forums. Is there a way they could get involved?
Yeah, for CTI League, you can drop us an email. We have a Twitter account, CTI League. My own email is mark, M-A-R-C, @cti-league.com. Or you can just search for CTI League and you'll find a ton of links. Drop me an email, Twitter, any message, let me know. The one thing I will say is it's not a spectator sport. As much as I would like to take everybody on board, we've built a trust community of people who have got specific skill sets to do things. If you believe you're somebody with a skill set like that, we'd welcome you. If not, we would suggest there are other organizations that can help. Volunteer. Everyone should volunteer no matter what your skill set is, because coming together, we can tackle a lot of these problems.
John?
Go ahead, Adio.
Yeah, I think we are touching the course of the discussion here about how that cooperation can happen, and I think giving incentive or working at the local level as well, and that's where probably parliamentarian can come in to ensure that there are appropriate incentive and knowledge available to actors on the ground to understand these challenges, so that the DNS doesn't stay something nebulous and remote for people in general, but something key, as we say. It's a fundamental element of securing our infrastructure and keeping the trust on the internet. So using the framework of the parliamentarian at the local level can help build that collaborative environment by tackling this in a more holistic way.
Okay, interesting. And I hear we have a question that was interesting from Jonathan Zook in the chat. Would you like to read it out, Luna?
Sure, one sec. So the question is, doesn't this call into question the rather conservative results we hear from researchers on the level of abuse?
And I find my unmute button.
John, you're muted. Oh.
Yeah, I got muted again. I'll take a little shot of that first, and then I'll hand it over to Mark, I think, to talk about the more general issue here. So I think what we were measuring specifically at ICANN, so I'm only going to talk about what we were doing, was really the registration of names that were used for very specific types of abuse. And we weren't, for example, measuring harm or anything like related to how many victims there were or anything like that. We at ICANN don't look at that kind of stuff. We don't have the information or the data for that. So I think it depends what data you look at, what picture you get. So when we look at ICANN at a situation where people are saying there are hundreds of thousands of names being registered and used abusively, that's not what we see in our data, and at least not being used for phish and for malware. But other people look at different data in different ways. So Mark, what would you say to that when people say, well, there's not that much abuse, is it worth it?
I would say that there are many pieces to this puzzle. The results that we have are based on the fact that we're a 1,500 person team across 80 different countries. So we recognize that we are only able to tackle the tip of the iceberg. And so we prioritize on protecting the medical sector, and we prioritize on taking what we perceive to be more significant risks. That doesn't mean the other risks aren't out there. And what perspective you have changes the view of what you see. And so I wouldn't actively discount anybody's data. I would look at the methodologies they use to collect that data and see how it fits into the picture, because one of my biggest concerns about the security industry as a whole is that due to the siloed nature, we do not have the whole picture, and that is going to increasingly become a problem.
And Samina, do you have any thoughts on this as somebody who does a lot of research in this area?
I fully agree with Mark that as researchers, we do not have a holistic view. So whatever is measured is a partial view. So it's very probable that the data do not necessarily agree. What is important is the methodology, and I think that would be the best contribution from the research area to the industry. That's it.
Okay, thank you for that. And I think we have a question in the pod, in the Q&A pod. Luna?
Question from, sorry about the pronunciation, Vyacheslav Erochan. You work at the protocol level and control the manipulation of DNS. What about DOH?
Okay, so DOH is a very different discussion to what we're having now, but maybe Adiel could take that for 5 seconds and give a little viewpoint on DNS over HTTPS, which is what DOH stands for.
Yeah. This is a little bit tangential to what we were talking about, but DOH actually is there for privacy of end user, making sure that information exchange between end user and their resolver are protected and not open for surveillance or information. So it adds a level of protection from user perspective, done from registration and use of the DNS as an abuse tool. So from a lighter perspective, we can say that it adds a layer of protection to this whole infrastructure if used properly. So the DOH debate by itself, it's a whole session by its own, but that's what I will say at this stage.
And of course, when people are interested in new security features, if you like to call them, or protocols, DOH is one of many, right? So there are other things that people should be looking at, DNS over TLS, DANE, and other things. And I see that Vyacheslav says in the statement that bad actors can use DOH as well. That is true of all technology. Whatever you build, bad people can use it. That's the same for the roads and DOH and every other technology that is out there. So yes, technology can be manipulated and bad people use it bad ways. And in many ways, that's kind of the reason we're here. During COVID-19, that's what they have done, not DOH, but other technologies, and used it for malicious purposes. That this is nothing unusual. I think with that, we will start to wrap up, and I'd like to give all of the speakers a few minutes if they have any last remarks they'd like to make. Adia, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, thank you. I think overall it has been an interesting discussion. My conclusion will be around reinforcing the fact that although the DNS seems like a passive service within the internet ecosystem in general, from user perspective, it's play an important role, and we need to collaborate and coordinate better when it comes to securing it, and also getting more effective in anticipating bad actors' behavior online. I will add that ICANN will continue to work with the community to improve knowledge, to improve capacity, and make more and more information available for people in this area.
And Samina, any last thoughts?
I would like to thank you for having us today and hosting this session. I totally agree with Adiel that a lot of the problems that we see today, as in security problems, technical security problems, are actually not really technical, mostly by misallied incentives of the players that are more capable to protect systems. So I would say our policies should be aligned in a way that we uplift the load from users that are normally the weakest link to more techie savvy actors in this ecosystem. And as it's also pointed in the chat, if measures should be collective action. So if we have measures that are taken by the majority of industry players, then we would also be able to reduce a whack-a-mole problem where attackers shift from a registry or registrars that is taking better measures to other ones that are less fighting less. Thank you.
Thank you. And Elena, do you have any departing words you would like to say?
Yes, thank you, John. First of all, thank you for having us and for listening to us today. I think I will come back to the question or the issue of how can parliamentarians, policymakers rather more generally, get involved, or what would be the role in this discussion. We've said a lot about breaking silos and need to collaborate better at the interested level. What I think I would like to point out here is that collaborating better, breaking silos is also true for when it comes to policymakers, if you will. They have a role in that. Of course, it's not the primary one, but they are the ones that are instituting laws and policies. And those policies can either help cybersecurity researchers and law enforcement only when to give them more tools, or might impede them. So better collaboration between us two can help in cases such as the COVID-19 or others that will emerge, or hopefully not in the future, and give the cybersecurity researchers the tool they need. Just as an example, an internet user on the internet, right, online, has, like in the physical world, all sorts of rights that need to be respected, such as the right to privacy, the right to security, right, the freedom of speech, everything like that. Now, it should not be on the shoulders of the industry or on the shoulders of the technical community to find what is the right balance in such cases. It's not for, this is something that policymakers need to do. So I'm giving an example of things where, from the side of policymakers, they can also make a difference. Thank you.
Thank you. And Mark, I'll give the last word to you before I wrap up.
Thank you. Well, in the words of Douglas Adams, don't panic. I would like to say that there has been some phenomenal work done in collaboration with policymakers. For example, I'd like to shout out the UK government's Secure by Design program, which is making a real difference in making IoT devices secure, and many other countries which are mirroring it, like Australia, Malaysia, and the US. This kind of work makes a massive difference. And it's an example that by collaborating between policymakers and the hacker security community, we can make a huge difference. And I would encourage all policymakers listening to this, please come speak to us and let us help you. And together we can take the bad guys down and protect your citizens.
Excellent point, Mark. Excellent. Luna, would you like to read out where people can get the slides? I know you've posted it into the chat, but just for the record.
Yes, no worries. So the slides will be posted on the IGF website under our sessions. So that should happen within the next 24 hours, I would say.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And thank you for your help during this, Luna, and all the other staff in the background that are helping that people don't see. I'd like to thank all of the panelists for participating. Thank you for spending your busy time with us today, and for the participants for taking part. You know, we're not past the COVID-19 situation yet. And I suspect it won't be the last global event where the bad guys take effect. So it's good to see everybody working together. Feel free to reach out to us. It's ICANN. If you have more questions, or if you want to learn how to participate. Also, I think I'll say this for you, Mark, feel free to reach out to Mark if you want to join the CTI League or learn more about it. We participate, so you can also reach out to me if you need to. With that, I think I'll give everybody 12 minutes of their lives back. Thank you, everybody. Thank you to the IGF for allowing us to do this panel. And good evening, good morning, good whatever time of the day is, and be safe, everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Thank you, everyone.